Welcome to another episode of Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. Pop songs are, in general, dominated by love songs. Happy, uplifting, and on occasion, aggressively irritating ones. There is, as we shall see, no shortage of I love you and you're the most beautiful girl in the world nonsense in J-pop either. However, this is a relatively recent movement in Japanese music. Back in the old days, happy love songs in Japan were vanishingly rare. In fact, I might go so far as to say they did not exist at all. So, today I would like to dive deep into the history of popular music in Japan and in the process probably say something mildly offensive about both cultures. You're welcome. This episode is something of a follow-up to episode 5 about Burton Crane, the accidental first pop star in Japan in the 30s, a man who stumbled into celebrity in the 1930s Tokyo while ostensibly working as a journalist. After that episode, I felt I hadn't done justice to his influence, which is still felt today, in my opinion. Perhaps less so now, but most certainly through the 1990s and arguably into the early 2000s. My mother was an active geisha until 2020. Geishas typically perform what could be approximated as pop music, spanning from the 19th century to around the 1930s. And I've watched her perform hundreds of times. One of her regular pieces concerns a geisha from Shimoda called Okichi. The 1958 Hollywood film The Barbarian and the Geisha starring John Wayne is loosely based on her story. The Japanese version of events is considerably darker than the Hollywood adaptation. Okichi, the protagonist, was a geisha who was pressured by local authorities to leave her young Japanese fiancé and go and look after the first US Consul General, Townsend Harris, a man old enough to be her dad. Harris eventually leaves Japan and returns to the US. Okichi, left behind, was treated by her community as a traitor, someone who had sold her soul and her honor to the Western barbarian. Despite the fact that she had no say in the matter whatsoever and did it for her country, she became an alcoholic and eventually committed suicide by drowning. My mother used to perform the dance number depicting Okichi's last night by the shore as opening acts for a childhood girl. It was certainly formative. My point is this. The music geishas perform falls into two broad categories. On one end, there are songs of extreme tragedy, about love, family misfortune, or the particular anguish of being a woman in the 19th century Japan, or even like dying an honorable death as a samurai and that sort of thing. On the other end of the spectrum, there are comedy numbers, usually involving sake drinking. I think you may be able to guess where this is going. Burton Crane's songs, including Sake ga nomitai, I Want to Drink Sake, fall squarely into the latter category. I do not recall my mother or any other geisha ever performing number about happy romantic love. When the music celebrates felicity, it is usually about drinking sake, marveling at beautiful nature, or a Shinto Matsuri festival, which is, in any case, largely fueled by alcohol. Never, ever about romantic love. I mean, happy romantic love. This may surprise you, but the phrase I love you did not exist in Japan until someone invented it approximately 150 years ago. Some of you may be thinking, hang on a minute, what about aishiteru or aishitemasu? Well, those words were coined specifically to translate Western literature in the late 19th century. The word chosen to render love was, as we all know, ai, originally a Buddhist term meaning attachment, lust, or desire. If anything, it carried a rather negative connotation. So did the Japanese know nothing of love before the Christian missionaries arrived to explain it in details? Of course they did. They simply did not feel the need to give it a label, expression, or shout about in public. when the Japanese person of the 19th century or earlier wanted to express romantic feelings, almost certainly not have used aishitemasu. The verb most likely employed was horeteru, horeteiru, meaning roughly, I am dazed by you or I am infatuated with you. It describes essentially what their pheromones are doing to your neurochemistry, which, if you think about it, is rather more honest than, you complete me. As some of you expats may have noticed, even today, young couples in Japan rarely kiss in public. They may hold hands, give each other a hug. Even that's less common here. And this difference leads someone sometimes to interpret as a lack of affection, a diagnosis I find wholly unconvincing. My own view is that displaying affection in public or even explicitly in private is not only traditional, but is considered, frankly, a bit unnecessary in Japan. If you genuinely care for each other, you know it. You don't need constant reassurance. And performing it in an audience is, at best, slightly embarrassing. This is not my opinion, mind you. I am merely analysing the Japanese culture and psyche here. I'm not saying one approach is superior to the other. Different strokes for different folks. Anyhow, in this tradition, happy romantic love songs are considered rather uncool and almost makes no sense. Well, not so much now, but back then. Songs about the melancholy of love, however, those were enormously popular. The lament of poor Okichi, the girl who eventually drowned herself broken-hearted after being abandoned by the man she'd been ordered to serve, and gradually began to feel for. That was excellent material for a Japanese song. And so the tragic love motif was, and remains to a lesser degree, the dominant theme in Japanese popular music. Let's turn to the other genre, comedy and novelty songs. When you actually look at the history of truly enormous hits, like multi-million selling hits in Japan before the 1980s, most of them are, frankly, comical. Starting obviously with Burton Crane's Sake ga Nomitai, the tradition runs deep. The first 7-inch single to sell over 1 million copies in Japan, released in December 1967, was Kaette Kita Yopparai, or The Drunkard Returns, by a band called the Four Crusaders. The premise: the drunkard gets killed in a motor accident, gets to heaven, proceeds to misbehave there at considerable length, and is eventually deported by God and returned to Earth. And that song sold approximately 2.8 million copies, the first million-seller single. The Japanese public apparently found Divine Deportation hilarious, and one cannot entirely disagree. The following year produced another phenomenon, Croneko no Tango, or Black Cat Tango, originally an Italian children's song called Volevo un gatto nero, which had, in a magnificent twist of fate, finished last in the 1969 Zucchino d'Oro competition in Italy. So the song fared considerably better in Japan. However, the Japanese lyrics bear absolutely zero relation to the Italian original. It was performed by a 6-year-old singer named Osamu Minagawa. In other words, a typical novelty song. What was not typical about this record, however, was that it sold 3 million copies and made young Minagawa the youngest artist ever to have a million-selling record. A song that came last in an Italian children's competition became one of the best-selling singles in Japanese pop history. And speaking of mega hits, the best-selling physical single in the history of Japanese pop music is called Oyoge Taiyaki-kun, or Swim Taiyaki. Released on Christmas Day 1975, it sold staggering 4.57 million copies and is certified by Guinness World Records as Japan's best-selling single. The song is about taiyaki, a fish-shaped Japanese sweet that escapes the griddle to swim freely in the ocean, only to be caught by a fisherman. And when you think of all-time best-selling songs in the West, what would they be? A Candle in the Wind, Rock Around the Clock, Mull of Kintyre, Do They Know It's Christmas Time, or White Christmas. Japan's all-time best-selling song is about a pastry attempting and failing to achieve freedom. I'm not making this up. This lineage of comedy songs is, in my view, where Burton Crane's influence is still felt today, in spirit at least. Without his hit recordings, these massive hit songs I just mentioned may not have existed, or may at least not have sold as much. And yet, one could equally argue that without the centuries-old tradition of sake-drinking comedy songs that geishas dance to even today, Burton Crane's records may not have found their audience either. History, as usual, is annoyingly circular. While in the West, songs have long served as vehicles for jolly romantic love. That was simply not the tradition in Japanese popular music. But what about today? If you listen to contemporary J-pop, there are plenty of happy love songs. Well, too many in my personal opinion. But then again, I'm merely a sad, grumpy old man. Anyhow, when and how did this shift occur? I undertook research into Japanese lyrics over the past 70 years, from the Kaiyokyoku and Enka era to modern J-pop, and the findings are rather interesting. So-called happy love songs have rarely constituted a majority ever. They hover persistently between 30% and maximum around 40%-ish of hit tunes, with, of course, notable exceptions. Between the 1950s and the 70s, what we call Showa era, something genuinely new happened, assisted by post-war optimism and the blossoming individualism that had been actively frowned upon before and during the war. Young Japanese singers began, for the first time in history, to sing songs glorifying happy romantic love. There is a famous hit tune from 1967 called Sekai wa futari no tame ni. The world exists only for the two of us. How romantic. By a chanteuse called Naomi Sagara. This sentiment would not have been tolerated in the pre-war era. In fact, I'm fairly confident it would have been banned. The Prime Minister at the time also reportedly criticized the song, arguing that the singer should have instead sung "The two of us exist only for the world," or for the country. That said, such songs were still a clear minority. The rough proportion of happy love songs between the 1950s and 70s remained below 35%. Unlike the American 1950s, that supposed golden age of optimism, Japan's post-war charts were dominated by enka and early kaiyokyoku, longing, unrequited love, extramarital affairs, and tearful separations. Songs about falling in love with a married man exist in English, certainly, but in Japanese enka, they were one of the most popular subgenres. Then came the 1980s and early 1990s, in other words, the bubble period, whose soundtrack was city pop, that everyone loves around the world today. And this was the peak of happy, or at least optimistic, pop music in Japan. Still below 50%, mind you, the deep cultural love of melancholy did not simply evaporate. But songs about weekend drives, urban romance and glittering nightlife temporarily displaced the traditional repertoire of weeping into your sake at 4 a.m. over someone else's husband. The economic boom had, it seems, briefly convinced the Japanese to enjoy themselves without guilt, which didn't last, of course. Then came Japan's so-called lost decades, also, incidentally, the era in which the term J-pop was coined. Yeah, it's quite a new term, J-pop. It was invented while I was in Britain. So when I got back to Tokyo in the late 90s and saw the word J-pop, I thought, what the hell? But anyway, as the economy cooled, the Japanese hit charts are filled with healing ballads, yashi as we call it, and more introspective love songs. The percentage of positive love song therefore declined, and that trend continues into this decade. To put this in broader perspective, when you analyze the Billboard Hot 100 and the UK official charts, a so-called golden age of optimism from the 1950s to the mid-1960s, so roughly 70 to 80% of hit songs classified as happy love songs, more than double Japan's figure at the same time. From the 70s onwards, however, that figure in the West dropped steadily, and today it sits below 30%. A major study of over 500,000 songs released in the UK between 1985 and 2015 found a clear downward trend in happiness as song themes. Modern Western hits tend to frame love through the lens of anxiety, ghosting, or the emotional aftermath of a relationship rather than an uncomplicated joy of entering a new one. It is apparently now fashionable to have at least one clinically diagnosable condition per chorus. So, what does all of this tell us? Well, in Japan, the trajectory of happy love songs follows a different cultural logic from the West. The British and the American charts have moved from happy to sad. Japan, by contrast, has a long-standing tradition of finding beauty in sadness, or what we call mono no aware, meaning the baseline for happy songs has historically been lower, but maybe slightly more resilient. Because people in Japan culturally and subconsciously know the eternal happiness tag that comes with brand new romantic love is somewhat on the verge of breaching the Trade Descriptions Act. But the romance has, by nature and by default, a tragic quality. And I stand by that. And I think, in some ways, on the rare occasion of encountering what could be approximated as felicity in this life, it makes us want to embrace it stronger. As the great bossa nova tune A Felicidade puts it, sadness has no end. Happiness does. Well, I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below. It helps this channel's algorithm, and the algorithm, unlike happiness, has no end. And on that note, this has been Post Whatever. If you found any of that remotely useful or even mildly diverting, do consider liking and subscribing. I'm Ken Nishikawa. Until next time, stay happy if you can manage it.